The Northwest by William Zeranski. Glenn pushed hard to close the door, fighting against a violent wind. Shutting out a last gust of snow flooding in, he drove the bolt into place, locking out the storm. He set his back against the door. A thick crust of snow across the shoulders of his mackinaw cracked and fluffed off, landing in piles on the dirt floor of the cabin. He pulled loose the scarf that held on a broad-brimmed hat. More snow fell. He looked up at the ceiling, which seemed to seize in short raucous breaths as the blizzard scuttled under the eaves and drove across the wood-shingled roof. "That wind is something, isn't it?" Joe Hogan, an old prospector, gazed up and chuckled. A heavy beard covered his face, but a mirth in his eyes shone bright. "It's cold. It's real cold." He leaned forward in his chair to hock and spit into the hearth of a small stone fireplace. The slava hissed, baking in the heat. "It's really cold. I told you that. I told you not to go out there." "I had to see." Glenn, a young man about 20, flexed his hands. The cold caused a deep ache in the joints. He tugged off his gloves and again flexed his fingers slowly, as if they were made of marble. Joe shook his head. "Now, put them under your arms." "What?" "Your hands." Joe illustrated by crossing his arms and putting his hands inside his heavy coat and into his armpits. Glenn nodded, hung his hat on a peg by the door, and undid his buttons, and slipped his hands inside his coat. His body wasn't that much warmer, but the cold of his hands still made him shiver. "Sit on down." Joe waved to a chair opposite him in front of the fireplace. Glenn took a seat and looked at the small chunks of wood burning, ashes glowing, and the funnel of smoke whirling up the chimney. "So, did you see what you're looking for?" The prospector pulled a plug of tobacco, bound in paper, and a multiplex knife from a big outer coat pocket. Glenn shook his head, grinned, and said, "No." "That's right. You saw nothing but gray and snow." The older man extracted a blade from the body of the knife, unwrapped the plug, and cut into it. "Here." Glenn took the piece and sniffed the strong odor of the compressed leaves. Taking tobacco was something he'd never done until arriving at Joe's cabin a week before. The first time the old man offered, he tried to refuse, but Joe went on about hospitality until he relented. Now he was content to take what was offered and set to chewing, looking forward to that mild sense of euphoria given by the tobacco. "No, there's nothing out there." Joe slipped the plug and knife back into his coat pocket. "Nothing but snow, cold, and that damn fierce wind coming off the mountains." A light snow began to fall when Glenn first arrived in the valley, having come up the long trail from the inlet where the steamship anchored at the town docks. He disembarked along with 30 others, but while they hopelessly sought lodgings, he bunked in with Joe Hogan. The arrangement had already been made by Glenn's brother, Graham, who'd arrived a couple months before. After meeting Joe, Graham moved on, traversing the pass to the mountain range that could no longer be seen because of the blizzard pummeling the landscape. After 4 days of continuous snow, nothing could be discerned. No days were seen to pass. Sunrise, sunset were just words having no meaning. All was dark and gray, fog, then snow and wind which tore through the valley. The trees shuddered, and the grass and shrubs were driven flat and buried. The wind surged round the cabin as a raging river current might throw a boat against the rocks. Glenn looked to the ceiling, hearing the rattle of wood shingles. "Don't worry." Joe grinned, his teeth stained by tobacco. "We'll be fine." Glenn nodded at the reassurance. Joe's eyes then sparkled with amusement as he said, "If the roof don't get ripped off." The young man smiled, vaguely, as the wind continued to pull at the roof. 40 below and plenty of snow." Joe chuckled and spit tobacco juice into the fireplace. "You'll be here until spring thaw. You didn't know that, did you?" He squinted at Glenn, studying him. "You look surprised." "I thought when this was done." Glenn gestured with an open hand to the roof. Joe spat and said, "When this is done? It's only begun. You go out there now, try to cross those mountains, and you will die. Don't get me wrong. Some other damn fools will try, but don't you. You still got 500 miles to go. You and a long line of men are going to have to slog through those mountains, but not now." Instantly, Joe sat forward. "But the gold?" "No one's going to be digging in that snow-covered ground, hard as rock. And the streams, they're all frozen over. No panning for gold there. It's time to wait. And it's forced on everybody. But don't you worry. The gold will be there, and you'll still be hungry for it." Joe rose from his chair and moved across the room, his boots thudding heavy on the dirt floor. He went to one of the two narrow beds set against the opposite wall. He reached underneath one and pulled out a wood box, a small trunk. He took a key from a trouser pocket, undid the padlock, lifted the lid, and rummaged inside. He withdrew what he sought, dropped the lid, and pushed the box under the bed with a boot. He returned to his chair, dangling a small canvas pouch by the strings. He settled into his seat and spat into the fire. Tobacco juice sizzled. He grinned at Glenn while loosening the tie in the pouch and slipped in searching fingers. "This is why you're here." He revealed a gold nugget held between index finger and thumb. "Now, feel that." He held out the nugget. Glenn eyed the small yet grand evidence of wealth and cautiously took it in hand, as if it could break, and marveled at the yellow luster. "Now squeeze it hard. Harder." Joe pressed his fingers together, and Glenn did the same. "Feel it bite into your skin? That's real, all right. And you won't forget it." The edges of the nugget scored deeply into Glenn's fingertips. The weight, the color, the substance excited his imagination. He smiled and rapidly nodded and said, "You're right. You can't forget." Joe laughed. "You'll get your chance. You will. The storm, it's nothing." "Yep," Glenn said, and dropped the nugget into the open neck of the pouch resting in the prospector's palm. He eased back in his chair, extended his legs, and spit tobacco juice into the fire. He'd have to wait, but that was fine. Spring would come. Then it would be his time, and he would go.